It is, okay. All right, good. I think I'm ready to roll here. Good. So first of all, can everyone hear me at the back? Audible? Okay, thank you. Okay, so first thanks to the organizing team, Andrew, Richard, Wendy, for organizing this great meeting. Looking forward to the talks today. And thanks for inviting me to give this talk. So unlike this guy here, I hope most of us have two functioning eyes. And we can, of course, move our heads. So we can collect multiple 2D projections of this room and use those projections to try to recover the 3D scene layout. But that's not why we're here. We're here because even if I show you an image like that, I think we can all pretty much get an immediate sense of the 3D scene layout to some degree, and also the shapes of some of the major objects, the 3D shapes of some of the major objects in the scene. So the question is, how do our brains do that, and can we get machines to do that as well? So I think this has been one of the central problems of both human vision science and computer vision for decades. And I think there's been kind of a rough agreement about how a good way to approach this problem, which is to think about the underlying physics, the photometry, the geometry, and identify the kinds of physical cues that can give us some estimates of various scene properties. And so what are those physical cues? Well, there are many, right? But so for example, shape from shading, we know is important. Depth from shadows is useful. Shape from texture, occlusions between objects. And I'm going to argue in particular in this talk that contours are important in a number of ways. And that's one of the objectives of Rossini, is to understand how object boundaries are informative about 3D. But anyway, you have your own favorite list probably of cues you're interested in. But the main point is that the idea has been to understand this underlying physics and break this down into components and try to understand how to get 2D cues that are informative about 3D. But also to realize that for a typical scene like this one here, none of these individual cues is going to be sufficient, right, to recover the 3D scene. And so it's a lot about cue integration. How can we integrate these cues in synergistic ways to give us useful information about both scene layout and 3D shape? Okay. And I think because there's been some at least rough agreement that this is a good kind of framework, both for human vision science and computer vision, there's been some nice interactions between these two communities as we've solved this problem. I think this is a good example, this workshop of that. Okay, but that's what I'm going to refer to now as the classical view of single view 3D perception. And I think we're now in a new era, which people often call the modern view in computer vision. And in the modern view, we still have the same input, so we still have the same single image here, color image. So one thing that's important about the modern view is that the output is always a raster map of depths, right? So one of the interesting questions in the classical view has always been, what should the representation of the 3D scene be, right? That question is no longer really addressed in computer vision. It's really understood that the representation is just a raster map, largely. But of course, the other big change is that instead of this breakdown in terms of physical cues, the physics of the problem, we have typically a monolithic kind of deep network, which of course is broken down. So for example, in this particular case, broken down into components. But these components are not the components of the physical problem, right? They're really in terms of the machine learning concerns of the deep network, whether it's convolutional or fully connected and how many layers and so forth. So to me, this is a real radical change. I'm sure to you too, it's a big radical shift in framework. And so I think it's a good opportunity. I think this is a great opportunity, this workshop, to think about what we may be gaining from this shift and what we might be losing from this shift. Okay, so in terms of gains, for sure what we're gaining is quantification, right? So one of the big nice things about the machine learning revolution in computer vision was that we're using labeled data sets so we can quantify performance, right? And we can actually say objectively that algorithm A maybe is better than algorithm B. Okay, so that's certainly good. And then the other thing I would say is really great, especially about deep networks, is that they are very powerful function approximators. So if we have a specific application we're interested in, and autonomous driving would be a good example, then we can collect a lot of data specific to that application, and then we can often build quite useful applications, right, for that using this very powerful deep network. Okay, so so those are the good things. What are some potential risks? So to me, two of the biggest risks, the first one is overfitting, right? So these are very high dimensional models, and so just as I said, if you collect a very large data set, then the model will fit a lot of the nuances of that data set, but if that data set doesn't include all possible cases you want to deploy in, then the system won't generalize, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But the biggest thing I wanted to talk about today was what is the risk to scientific understanding. Okay, so I think most of us in the room are interested in the science underlying single view 3D perception, and I think there's a real risk that oh, there we go. There's a real risk that we're kind of losing the computer vision people here in understanding this computation, because it's very hard to pull out of this very high dimensional deep network the underlying physics and geometry, the principles, if you like, that are underlying the inference. And although, especially in the popular press, we talk about these networks as being biologically inspired in kind of a perverse way, I would say it leads to a kind of a separation or scission between the computer vision and the human vision communities, because we no longer have this kind of common understood framework to work in. Okay, so that's kind of my pitch for the beginning of the talk, is to think about that framework shift. And I guess what I want to argue is that, of course we're not going to throw out deep networks, but in parallel to deep network research, I think we should not completely abandon that kind of classical view, and we should be thinking about breaking down the problem into components and trying to understand the physics and the geometry and everything behind each of those components. So that's my kind of pitch for today. So in particular, and if we do that, we can continue to have this interaction between the two communities and assess how good humans are at tasks and try to get machines to perform a similar way, or even better, maybe, and then look at specific cues. And the cues I'm going to focus on in my talk are contour cues to depth. Okay, so let's get going. So first of all, I want to address the first thing, which is how do humans and machines perform relative to each other on the problem of single view 3D perception. Surprisingly, we don't really know. People haven't done that many studies, general studies of that problem. So let me talk about some recent results we have on that. This is the work of my postdoc Kedar Valankar at York. Also collaboration with Chris Singer, who's now at Melbourne, and then of course Wendy and Eric Graff from Southampton. You can see Wendy is generously illustrating the principle of occlusion here as a cue to depth. Okay, so it's quite a very simple study. So we're going to make use of the SINS data set that Wendy described. And in particular, we're going to take about 60-degree projections, planar projections, from the spherical image. These will all be along the horizontal axis. Okay, so he's sweeping these planar projections around the horizon. And then we're simply going to ask our observers, our human and machine observers, to make ordinal depth judgments in the scene. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, but there are two markers here in magenta, one here and one here. And your job, if you were in this experiment, is to say which one is closer to you. Okay? We can pose that task to both our humans and our machines. And these are the kind of data we get. Okay, so this is plotting proportion correct on the y-axis versus the difference in depth between the 2 points in meters. This particular plot is for a mean depth of 10 meters, okay? So the average depth of the 2 points is 10 meters. And the curves are showing the performance of humans, which are in dark blue, and then a whole bunch of different machine models in different colors. Okay, so what can we see from this plot? So first of all, obviously as we increase the depth difference, the observers get better because the task gets easier, right? But you can see that there's a huge variation in performance here. And one of the striking things is that humans are way better than all of these other models, okay? So a couple things to know. So first of all, these models are all pre-trained, so we're not fine-tuning on the SINS data set, okay? So they're pre-trained on, for example, NYU2, Make3D, Kitty data sets. But keep in mind that the SINS data set, to me, is a kind of a normative data set, right? So we have a camera at eye height, we have horizontal projections, and these are scenes that are fairly sampled from around southern England. So they're pretty normal scenes. And so we would hope, I think, that these algorithms would be able to give useful information. But they perform generally quite a bit poorer than human observers, shown in dark blue here, except this one spectacular machine observer shown in kind of a dark forest green here. And that is what we call the elevation-only model. So what is the spectacular computer vision model called elevation only? Okay, so to understand, so my observations here. So to understand that model, let's take a human observer in a typical scene, and let's say it looks like her head's roughly horizontal. Let's suppose that her gaze is also horizontal, so that means that her image plane would be roughly vertical, right? So what that means is that a point on the ground plane that's near to her will project to somewhere low in the image, right? Whereas a point that's further from her on the ground plane will project to be higher in the image, right? And so in other words, there's going to be a lawful relationship between the distance of points on the ground plane and the height that they project to in the image. And as Wendy pointed out in her talk, the ground plane, and in fact, in some cases, other horizontal planes, are really dominant in a lot of these statistics. And that can be seen here. This is, again, for the SINS data set, plotting log distance versus elevation for all the points in the scene, not just the ground plane. You can see there's a very strong relationship. So this amazing computer vision model simply says whichever point is higher in the image is further from my eye. And that performs as well as humans and beats all the other deep learning models for the SINS data set. Okay? So I don't know about you, but I find that a bit alarming, first of all. And it suggests we have to be quite careful when we look at performance results for whatever, for humans or machines. Now, it doesn't tell us whether humans and machines are using the elevation Q, but we can measure that. So here we're plotting the performance-controlled correlation between each of these observers as a function here of the mean depth. So we vary the mean depth of the 2 points. And of course, the maximum correlation you can have is 1. And you can see that humans are very, very correlated with this elevation Q. And this is performance controlled. So this means basically that all humans are doing, almost all that they're doing in this particular task is to use the elevation Q. And the machine models overall are also making heavy use of that Q, although there's quite a bit of variation in that. Okay, so the observation is that humans and most machine models rely heavily on elevation. So that suggests a control experiment, of course, where we repeat the experiment, but we take away the elevation Q, right? So now the two markers are at the same elevation, so you can't use that Q. So what happens to results? So one of the big things that happens is that everybody gets way worse, right? So the humans, for example, drop in performance substantially. And many of our models, most of our models, can no longer do the task. They're at chance for the SINS data set. Okay, so just to summarize this study, so this is not published yet, we just presented it at PSS, but I think hopefully it's useful in kind of a wake-up call. Gives evidence that these deep models are generalizing poorly to what I think is a fairly normative task, and that both humans and machines rely, if they're given the opportunity to use gaze elevation, rely upon that. Okay, but we did show that when we take that gaze elevation cue away, the humans and some of the models are still able to do something. So the question is, what is that something? What's the residual that's useful after elevation is taken away? So that's what I want to talk about now. So as I mentioned, of course, there's many cues to depth, and Wendy talked about a few of them. I'm going to focus on contour cues to depth, and I'll in particular focus on three things: depth edges, object boundaries, and lines. And so let's just talk about edges first. So this is led by Chris Inger, now at Melbourne, and then with also Wendy and Eric. Okay, so what's the motivation here? So I think we can motivate this well by going back to this natural task and saying, well, suppose we fix the elevation now, what are we going to do? Well, in this particular case, notice that if we were able to infer that there's a depth boundary between the 2 points, that's going to inform us about this 2-point ordinal depth task, right? So that kind of motivates being able to detect these depth edges. But that itself is not a trivial problem, because of course there's many different kinds of edges in an image. There's depth edges, there's reflectance edges, shadow edges. So how do we discriminate the depth edges from these other kinds of edges? And the worry is that this might be kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? To be able to discriminate these different kinds of edges, maybe all we need to do is parse the scene, right? Figure out the layout of the scene, but the idea is we want to use these depth edges to help us parse the scene. Okay, so that's a bit of a problem. So how do we get around that? So one idea is that if the depth edges can actually be classified based just on local information, then we kind of break this chicken and egg problem, right? We can consider the problem of depth edge classification to be an early vision problem, right? Get some kind of estimate of these depth edges and then use them to try to parse the scene. Okay. So that's what this project is about, is trying to figure out whether this can be defined as a local visual problem. We can test that by presenting human and machine observers with just a little patch of the image centered at the edge, and ask the observers if they can discriminate that to be either a depth edge or some other kind of edge. And so in this case, to compare against our human observers, we built a very small deep network, which takes as input the color image patch and then delivers as output this binary label. Okay. So what do we get from this? So what we find is that actually both the humans and the machine observer can do pretty well at this task. We get about 85 or 90% performance. Just based upon this local image patch. So that's kind of encouraging that, at least to some degree, we can think of this problem of depth edge classification as being an early vision problem. How are we solving this problem? So given this patch, what features are we using? So we don't totally have an answer to that, but what we do know is that certainly dominant are color contrast cues. So this is kind of a very busy slide, but here, for example, I'm showing the correlation between the human responses and various color contrast and color intensity cues. So the intensity cues are shown in solid curves, and then the various kinds of contrast are shown in dotted and dashed curves. So the main point here is that the correlations are bigger for the contrast cues than for the intensity cues. This is also true for the deep network model. And also, if you look at the log likelihood for these individual cues, these contrast cues are more reliable predictors, just in an objective sense. And so there's some commonality between what the humans and the network are doing, and performance is pretty similar between the two. So that's kind of a nice story. Maybe this is a good computational model for human depth edge discrimination. But that turns out not to be entirely true. So if we look at the directly between the model and the human judgments, now we find that certainly it's highly positive. It's the correlation shown as a function of the size of the patch here. But there's a gap between that and the correlation between different individual human observers. Okay? So there's something that you and I do when discriminating these edges that's not captured by the model. So we still don't understand what that is. So something interesting to work on moving forward. Okay, so just to summarize this part of the talk, main point is that we're claiming that to some degree this model, this problem of depth edge discrimination can be solved locally, and then we have a simple deep model that seems to capture at least some of what humans are doing. So now to move to the next part of the talk, what I'd like to ask is there more information from object boundaries that can be used to make judgments about the 3D scene? So in particular, suppose we were so successful at this depth edge discrimination that we were able to get all of the depth edges around the boundary of the object. And the question I have for you is, do you think there's more information in the shape of that planar contour that could tell us something about the shape of the 3D object, beyond the fact that it's just in front of the background? Okay. So that's the second project. This is also with Chris and also my PhD student, Yiming Chan, and collaborator Laurie Wilcox at York. Okay, so just to get the terminology clear here, so suppose we have a 3D solid object in the world. That, of course, is going to project as a 2D region in your image. And we'll call the boundary of that 2D region in the image the bounding contour. And, of course, that's a planar contour. Now, we think about the back projection of that planar contour back onto the surface of the solid object. It's important to note that contour lying on the solid object will not generally be frontal parallel, right? In general, it's going to be oblique to the line of sight. And also, in general, that space curve is not going to be a planar curve. It's going to torque in and out of the plane, right? So it's a general 3D curve. So at following coordinate, we're going to refer to that 3D contour as the rim, the 3D rim. And so the problem we're trying to address here is it possible to use the 2D bounding contour in the image to say anything about the depth variation in the 3D rim? And the reason that's interesting is that that would give us a first kind of cut on the pose of the object, right? And maybe even some information about its 3D shape. Okay, so there's not a lot of work on this. So to kind of investigate this empirically, we're making use of a 3D object data set called ShapeNet. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And we're randomly sampling from that data set, and then we're going to randomly compute 2D projections of these objects at random angles. And so in doing that, we'll end up with a data set of pairs of 2D image contours and corresponding 3D rims, okay? And we can use those pairs to train and to psychophysically test. So, for example, we can present to human observers a silhouette which just contains the information of this 2D image object boundary, and conduct this two-point ordinal task that we conducted for natural scenes, right? It's exactly the same task. And we have the ground truth, of course, because we have the corresponding 3D rim. So the question is, can you judge which of these 2 points is closer to you based only on the shape of the occluding boundary? And the answer is that on average, yes, humans can do this task above chance. We're not spectacular at this, for sure, but there's certainly information there, and humans are able to use some of that information. Okay, so this is, again, very recent results. We haven't published this yet, but we've done some work on trying to understand a little more about what humans could be doing here. And one of the first questions that arose, we were asked at least, was, well, maybe this is kind of a cognitive thing, right? So these are real objects, so you recognize the object and you kind of work backward logically. Well, if this is the object, then I think this point must be in front. So maybe you're kind of filling in the details inside the object. Or the alternative is, no, it's more of a perceptual judgment, so it has to do with the geometry of perspective projection. So to try to get at that question, one idea is to see if this monocular cue to depth interacts with other perceptual cues to depth. And then if it does, it could be argued that, well, this is probably more of a perceptual rather than a cognitive process. So to do that, we're going to repeat the experiment, but add in binocular stereopsis cues, okay? So in the first condition, we'll just present that silhouette in the correct binocular stereoscopic projection, and just like in Wendy, I'm just going to show this in motion parallax, but in the actual experiment, the objects are stationary and projected stereoscopically. Okay, so now you have consistent monocular and binocular cues. So the question then becomes, what happens if we introduce cue conflict and dissociate those cues? So we have two ways of doing that. So in the first way, we're going to take those disparities, this is kind of perverse, we take the disparities and rotate them cyclically 90 degrees around the object, okay? So now there's no proper correspondence between the disparity and the shape. And that gives you this kind of weird, distorted object. And the second thing we tried was just remove the monocular shape altogether and produce this, just have a circular shape, and then this kind of looks like a potato chip, or a crisp, I guess you call it, a crisp. Okay, so the question is, what happens when you dissociate those two cues? And what happens is the performance of the human observers for the cue consistent case is shown in green, and the performance for the cue conflict cases is shown in blue and red. So we get this clear drop in performance when we dissociate the monocular and binocular cues. So the argument is that suggestive that this is the monocular cue is kind of a perceptual cue as opposed to cognitive cue. Okay, so we know humans can do the task, and we know that this seems to be a kind of a perceptual process, but what is there a model, or what are we doing computationally? Okay, so we still don't know. That's the spoiler alert. We don't really have a good model yet for what humans are doing. So what I'm going to do is just show a couple of statistical models to show that, in fact, you can build a model that can do the task. So here's the world's simplest model. It's kind of the analog to the height in the image model for judging distance in scenes. So if you're trying to explain perspective projection to your 5-year-old or your 4-year-old, one of the first things you might say is, well, in perspective projection, objects that get closer to you produce images that are bigger, right? And so following that line of reasoning, what if we just say, given 2 points on the boundary, I'm going to assume that the point that's further from the center of the object is closer to my eye, right? That would be kind of the logical follow-through of the explanation of perspective projection. And indeed, if you look statistically at this data set, that's exactly what happens on average. As the eccentricity of the point increases, the distance from the eye decreases, okay? And it turns out that if you use that simple observer, that performs roughly the same as humans on this task. That doesn't say that that's what humans are doing, but it does say that there is something in that model. Okay, so beyond that, we can try to build slightly more sophisticated statistical models for estimating the unknown depth. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but one simple thing to try, I think, is to just assume that the observable data, that is the shape of the contour in the image, is jointly normal with the unknown, which is the depth variation z, okay? So that's what we do here in version 1 of this model. Just assume a multivariate normal model. We can, of course, learn the parameters of that from training data. And then since it's a generative model, at inference time, we're just given the image curve, and we can impute the expectation of the z-coordinate around the shape, okay? And then version 2 is just a slightly more sophisticated version where we develop a local Taylor series around the contour. So we just augment the observable space. So you think of that as kind of trying to linearize the problem to give the multivariate normal model a little more, a higher dimension to capture the relationship between the shape of the object and the unknown z coordinate. Okay, so these are just very simple multivariate normal models. The final thing we've tried is just build an autoencoder. So brute force, just train an autoencoder to estimate z given the image contour. Okay, so what did we find? So we measured performance as a function of field of view. So obviously as the field of view increases, we have more perspective information, performance gets better. And what we know is that you can do much better than that simple, the 5-year-old, call it the 5-year-old model of perspective projection by using these statistical models. And one thing that's interesting is so far, at least in our hands, we haven't been able to build an autoencoder that performs better than that simple multivariate normal model, which is kind of nice because the multivariate model is generative. But it could be, of course, we're just not, using the right metaparameters for the deep network. Okay, now, is this good or, is this impressive? So we've got Pearson correlations. These are not massive Pearson correlations, I should point out, okay? So it's really, we're just, scoping out this territory here and showing that there is information there. If you want to get a sense of how this works in practice, so here is an example from the held out test set, the best performance of the multivariate model, median performance, worst performance. So of course in the worst case, we just get everything absolutely backwards, right? So that's not very good. But the most important thing probably is the median case. So here, ground truth is shown in red. This is the z, the depth parameter, is a function of arc length. So we're marching around the contour. And what you can see is that the model is kind of getting a general trend, right? The low frequency trend, but it's missing all the high frequency details. So there's still lots that is not in the model. Okay, so just to summarize this second part here, so what we've argued is that there is information in the silhouette or the object boundary that can be used to estimate something about 3D variation in the rim. And that this seems to be perceptual in the sense it interacts with binocular cues. And then we've developed some simple computational models that yield significant predictions of that. We don't yet know which of these models is the best model for human perception. So that's something that we still hope to do. Okay, so that's edges, object boundaries. So the last thing I wanted to mention was some work we've done on using lines. And this is the work, this is one of the main topics for my PhD student, Yiming, and collaboration with Sri Ramalingam from Utah. Okay, so we spent a lot of time at the beginning talking about these beautiful natural scenes, but the reality, I think we tried very carefully in SINS to sample fairly, but we sampled fairly in geographic terms, right? So you can imagine a different approach where we try to sample fairly in human terms, right? So we sample from all the individuals on the planet, then it's going to be a very different data set, right? Because in a lot of these geographic regions, there aren't that many people, right? So I think if we did the second SIN, maybe this will be SINS 2, this would be more like the typical scene, right? That we would have. This is the scene outside the building we're in right now. And I think this is kind of typical of where most of us, for better or worse, we live. But from the computer vision point of view, or from the vision point of view, this is maybe good because there's lots of regularity in these scenes that's useful for single view 3D vision. And in particular, what we focused on a lot in our work is the so-called Manhattan world, where you have in the scene 3 families of planes that are mutually orthogonal, right? So horizontal planes and 2 sets of orthogonal vertical planes. And this is a pretty big topic in computer vision, but also I think we're beginning to learn that there are specific structures in the primate brain, or the human brain at least, that are selective for this rectilinear structure. So this is showing results from Roger Tutel's lab that shows selectivity specifically for rectilinear versus these other non-rectilinear kinds of stimuli can be further reduced down to these very simple contour fragments. And these areas are, for example, parahippocampal place area and neighboring regions of the brain. Okay. It's not too surprising because this is where we live, right? And it would make sense that we have the machinery in our heads to process this rectilinear, these rectilinear cues. So in computer vision, one of the nicest things about these Manhattan frames is they can be used to calibrate cameras. So we can use them to estimate the 3D rotation of the camera frame relative to the scene, and also even estimate the focal length and principal point. And we've worked quite a bit on that problem. But for the key thing is that, well, how are we able to do this? Well, really, it's best described as the use of linear perspective, right? The use of linear perspective, in particular 3-point perspective, for this particular regularity. But for the purpose of today's talk, the important question I want to ask is, can we make use of this computation to recover the actual shape of the objects in the scene? And so the reason we think that might be possible is that as a byproduct of this algorithm to estimate the camera parameters, we get this labeling of the major line segments in terms of their 3D orientation. Okay, so here the verticals are shown in green, the horizontals shown in red and blue. And so the question is, can we from this representation reconstruct a 3D model of the object? And I just want to point out, it's not totally trivial, because although we have the orientation of these segments, we don't know the distance of each of the segments from the eye, right? So we have an unknown degree of freedom for each of these segments. How are we doing for time?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, I think I'm okay. All right. So we need to somehow solve for these distances. And so the key insight is pretty simple here, is what if we were able to, for example, determine that this red segment up here is joined to this blue segment here, right? In other words, there's a junction here. Then these two segments become coupled, and we've reduced those 2 degrees of freedom down to 1 degree of freedom, right? So if we can continue to play that game, then we can resolve all of these degrees of freedom down to just a single scaling parameter, okay? So that's, I think, a good way of thinking about it, because it makes it clear that the problem of 3D reconstruction becomes a problem of perceptual grouping. We just have to solve this perceptual grouping problem, and we know something about how to do that. Okay, so this led to this algorithm we call LS3D. Sounds a bit psychedelic, but it stands for line segments to 3D. And I'm not going to have time to go into detail, but I guess the important thing I want to emphasize is that this is a retro algorithm. It's a classical algorithm. There's no deep network that comes anywhere near this algorithm. And as a consequence, it's very explainable. If I had a little more time, I'd be able to explain it. But really, the main ideas are grouping by proximity, first of all. And then there's the application of sort of well-understood computer science algorithms. So there's a first stage where we do the grouping I described of these segments into junctions. And that's solved as a bipartite matching problem. And we know how to do that, solve it exactly in cubic time. There's a second stage of computing things called minimum spanning trees. So these are just small graphs that represent those junction relationships. And that gives us this kind of structure here where we have these kind of little 3D scaffolds that we're very confident about, but we don't know their distance from the eye. Okay, so it's kind of like a Manhattan salad, right? So we have kind of little bits of structure. But that's important, because now what we're going to do is produce a covering of these scaffolds. So we get these little solid cuboidal models. And then finally, that's going to allow us to reason about surfaces. Now we have surfaces for these little structures. And the final step is kind of a global L1 minimization of the distance between parallel surfaces on these cuboidal structures. So the idea here is we're trying to explain the scene with the minimum number of global planes. Okay, so you think of it as a principle of simplicity, if you like. All right. So that produces, one of the nice things about this classical approach is instead of producing a raster map, it produces a CAD model. And for many applications, that's more valuable than a raster map. But we can convert to raster maps to compare against deep network models. So here, for this image, this is the ground truth. This is the LS3D output, 2 different versions. This is typical deep network output. So it's qualitatively quite a bit different, right? So the classical approach is producing this CAD model. The deep network approach kind of produces this amorphous range map. Quantitatively, we perform better on this Manhattan data set. Now, obviously, we wouldn't perform better if there wasn't Manhattan structure. So, so you need a system that was able to detect, yes, this is Manhattan, and so it's appropriate to apply this technique. But I think, to me, the most interesting thing is the difference in complexity and explainability, right? So these deep network models have on the order of 60 or 70 million free parameters, and LS3D has 1 parameter. Okay? So I think, getting back to the original part of the talk, I think there's something to be said for continuing with a kind of classical approach in parallel with deep networks. All right, so just to summarize this last part, simple computational model based upon proximity delivers a 3D CAD model, is highly explainable, so scientifically useful. We don't yet know how this compares to human perception. Maybe some of the other talks in today's session will provide some guidance on that, but it's something we'd like to know. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. So just last word, I guess, would be, again, my pitch to continue to be thinking about the physics and the geometry and photometry that underlie single view 3D perception. Okay, thanks.